The dust cloud rising from the runaway wagon was visible from half a mile away, and Ethan Hayes knew immediately that whoever was in that vehicle was heading straight toward disaster. He had been riding the fence line of the Murphy Ranch just outside Naco, Arizona territory, checking for breaks in the wire when he spotted the careening wagon and heard the terrified screams cutting through the afternoon air. Without a second thought, he spurred his horse forward, his heart hammering as he calculated the angle he would need to intercept before the wagon reached the rocky outcropping that jutted into the road ahead. The horses pulling the wagon were wild with panic, their eyes rolling white as something had spooked them beyond reason. Ethan could see a woman in a green dress clinging to the seat, her bonnet long gone, blonde hair whipping in the wind as she struggled with reins that had clearly slipped from her control. He pushed his horse harder, feeling the powerful muscles bunching beneath him as they closed the distance. The thunder of hooves filled his ears, mixing with the rattle of the wagon wheels and the woman's cries for help. Ethan pulled alongside the lead horse, reaching out to grab the bridle even as his own mount kept pace. His fingers missed twice, and then finally closed around the leather. The force nearly yanked him from his saddle, but he held on, using all his strength and weight to gradually slow the panicked animals. His shoulders screamed in protest, muscles straining as he talked in a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the chaos. It took nearly 100 yards, but finally the horses began to slow, their terror giving way to exhaustion and the calm authority in Ethan's voice. When the wagon finally came to a complete stop, Ethan dismounted quickly and tied off the team before turning to check on the woman. She was shaking violently, her hands still gripping the seat so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her face was pale beneath the dust that coated her skin, and he could see tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. "Are you hurt, madam?" Ethan asked, reaching up to help her down from the high seat. His voice was rough from years of silence more than conversation, but gentle with concern. She looked down at him with eyes the color of spring grass, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then she nodded, not in answer to his question, but as if confirming to herself that she was indeed alive. "I think I am unharmed," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Just frightened half to death." He helped her down, and she stumbled slightly when her feet hit the ground, her legs unsteady. Ethan steadied her with a hand on her elbow, careful to be respectful even as he made sure she would not fall. Up close, he could see she was young, probably around 23 or 24, with delicate features and a stubborn set to her jaw that suggested she was not usually the type to need rescuing. "What spooked them?" he asked, glancing back at the horses that now stood with heads hanging, sides heaving. "A rattlesnake," she said, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "It came out of nowhere, right across the road. The horses panicked and the reins slipped right through my hands. I have never felt so helpless in all my life." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, taking in his weathered face, the gray starting to thread through his dark hair at his temples, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. "You saved my life. I do not even know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," Ethan said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. He was not used to being looked at like that, like he mattered. "Just glad I was in the right place. Where were you headed?" "Naco," she said, brushing at her dress in a futile attempt to remove some of the dust. "I am Georgia Norris. I just arrived from Boston 3 days ago to take a teaching position at the new schoolhouse. I was staying with the Hendersons at their ranch while I waited for my quarters in town to be ready, and Mrs. Henderson needed supplies. She asked if I would take the wagon since her husband was out with the cattle, and I foolishly said yes, even though I am not very experienced with driving. "Ethan Hayes," he said, tipping his hat. "I work the neighboring ranch, or I did anyway. The owner died last month and his son is selling the place. I expect I will be moving on soon enough." Something flickered across Georgia's face, an expression Ethan could not quite read. She seemed about to say something when a party of riders appeared on the road behind them, coming from the direction of Naco. The lead rider was a portly man in his 50s with a badge gleaming on his vest, and Ethan recognized Sheriff Tom Granger. "Saw the dust cloud from town," the sheriff called as he reined in. "Everyone all right here?" Georgia explained what had happened while Ethan checked the wagon and horses more thoroughly. Everything seemed intact, though the horses would need rest before making the journey back. The sheriff knew Ethan by reputation and nodded approvingly when he heard how the rescue had unfolded. "Lucky thing you were nearby, Hayes," Granger said. "Miss Norris here is going to be teaching our children. Would have been a tragedy to lose her before she even started." He turned to Georgia. "I will send word to the Hendersons that you are safe. Why do not you ride back with us, and we will have someone fetch the wagon later once the horses have calmed down proper." But Georgia surprised them all by shaking her head. "If Mr. Hayes does not mind, I would prefer to wait with him until the horses are ready. I feel responsible for them, since it was my inexperience that got us into this situation. Besides, I would like to thank my rescuer properly, perhaps over supper in town if he would accept the invitation." Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. He could not remember the last time a woman had invited him anywhere, let alone a woman like Georgia Norris with her refined Boston accent and educated manner. He was 42 years old, had spent most of his adult life working ranches across Arizona Territory and New Mexico, and had long ago accepted that he was meant to be alone. The war between the states had taken whatever ability he had to connect with people, leaving him more comfortable with horses and cattle than human company. "That is kind of you, madam, but not necessary," he started to say, but she cut him off with a look that reminded him of a schoolteacher even though she had not yet taught a single day. "It absolutely is necessary," Georgia insisted. "You risked your own safety to save mine. The least I can do is buy you a meal, unless you have somewhere else you need to be." The truth was he had nowhere to be and nothing waiting for him except an empty bunkhouse and his own thoughts. The other ranch hands had already left to find new positions, and Ethan had been staying on only to finish up the last of the work before the new owner took possession. He found himself nodding before he fully decided to accept. "Supper would be fine, madam. Thank you." The sheriff and his men rode off, leaving Ethan and Georgia alone with the horses and wagons in the fading afternoon light. The Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the distant mountains. It was the time of day Ethan usually liked best, when the worst of the heat had passed, and the world seemed to hold its breath before the cool of evening arrived. Georgia sat on a smooth boulder near the road while Ethan tended to the horses, giving them water from the canteen he carried and speaking to them in that same low, calm voice that had helped stop their panic. She watched him work with an intensity that made him self-conscious, though he tried not to show it. "You have a gift with animals," she observed after a while. "The way you calmed them was remarkable. How did you learn to do that?" Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just time and practice, I suppose. Horses are simpler than people in most ways. They react honest to how you treat them. No hidden motives or complicated feelings." "That sounds like a man who has been disappointed by people," Georgia said softly. He glanced at her, surprised by her perception. "Maybe. Or maybe just a man who is better suited to this kind of life." He gestured at the open landscape around them, the endless sky and rough terrain that defined Arizona territory in the year 1885. "I am not sure I believe that," Georgia said. "I think people are exactly as capable of honesty as animals if we give them the chance. I think sometimes we hide behind our fears instead of risking connection." "That is a very optimistic view, Miss Norris. I expect you will find the West tests that optimism pretty quick." She smiled, and it transformed her whole face, making her seem to glow in the golden light. "Perhaps, or perhaps the West needs more optimism, not less. Boston certainly had its share of cynics and isolation despite being crowded with people. At least here there is space to breathe and sky to dream under." Ethan found himself intrigued despite his usual reserve. Most people who came west from the eastern cities complained endlessly about the hardships and primitive conditions. Georgia seemed genuinely enchanted by the landscape that he took for granted. "What made you decide to come all the way out here to teach?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. He was not usually one for conversation, but something about her made him curious. Georgia was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "I wanted to make a difference. In Boston, I was just another teacher at a school that had dozens of them. The children came from wealthy families who could afford anything. Here, I was told, the children are hungry for education, and the community needs someone committed to staying and building something lasting. That appealed to me more than the comfort and familiarity of home." "It is not an easy life out here," Ethan warned, "especially for a woman alone." "I did not come here expecting easy," Georgia replied with that stubborn tilt to her chin again. "I came here expecting meaningful. There is a difference." By the time the horses had calmed enough to make the journey back to Naco, the sun was setting in earnest, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Ethan helped Georgia back onto the wagon seat and then mounted his own horse to ride alongside her, ready to intervene if the team showed any signs of nervousness. But the animals plodded along calmly now, tired from their earlier exertion and content to follow the familiar road. Naco was a small town that had sprung up near the Mexican border, owing its existence to the railroad and the copper mines that dotted the surrounding hills. Main Street consisted of perhaps 20 buildings, including 2 saloons, a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, a hotel with a restaurant on the ground floor, and various other establishments that served the miners, ranchers, and railroad workers who made up the population. It was rough around the edges, but had pretensions of respectability, evidenced by the church and schoolhouse that the founding families had insisted upon. Georgia directed Ethan to park the wagon behind the general store, where the owner came out to check on his horses and expressed relief that both they and Georgia were unharmed. News of the runaway wagon had clearly spread through the small community, and several people stopped to inquire about Georgia's welfare as she and Ethan walked toward the hotel restaurant. Inside, the restaurant was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and oil lamps providing warm light against the gathering darkness. The proprietor, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, showed them to a table near the window and brought water while they looked at the limited menu. "The stew is good tonight," she said. "Fresh beef and vegetables with bread that came out of the oven an hour ago." They both ordered the stew, and after the proprietor left, an awkward silence fell between them. Ethan was acutely aware that he was out of practice with social situations, especially dining with a woman. His hands felt too large and clumsy, and he was not sure where to look that would not seem like staring. Georgia seemed to sense his discomfort and took mercy on him. "Tell me about the ranch you work on," she said. What was your employer like before he passed away? Grateful for the neutral topic, Ethan found himself talking more than he had in months. He told her about old Samuel Murphy, who had built his ranch from nothing and treated his workers fairly even in hard times. He talked about the cattle and horses, the daily rhythms of ranch work, the satisfaction of seeing calves born healthy in spring and crops harvested in fall. He even mentioned some of the challenges, the drought years, and the occasional conflicts with rustlers or wild animals. Georgia listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was really trying to understand this world that was so different from her own experience. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, the private school where she had taught, her reasons for wanting something more meaningful. She spoke about her father, a banker who had died 2 years earlier, and her mother, who had remarried and moved to Philadelphia, leaving Georgia feeling unmoored and ready for a new beginning. "So we are both starting over in our own ways," Georgia said thoughtfully. "You looking for a new position, me settling into a new life. It is strange how circumstances bring people together, is it not? If the Murphy's son had not decided to sell the ranch, you might not have been riding that fence line today. And if I had been more experienced with driving, I would not have needed rescuing. All these small choices and chances that led to that exact moment." "I never thought of it that way," Ethan admitted. "I just go where the work is and do not think too much about the why of it." "Maybe you should think about it more," Georgia suggested. "Maybe there is more purpose in your path than you give credit for." The stew arrived, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. Ethan was surprised to find himself relaxed, the earlier awkwardness fading into something almost comfortable. Georgia had a way of putting him at ease, of making conversation feel natural rather than forced. After they finished eating, Ethan walked Georgia to the house where she was staying temporarily with the schoolteacher she was replacing, an elderly woman named Mrs. Crawford, who was retiring after 30 years of service. The house was a modest structure on the edge of town, painted white with a small garden in front. "Thank you again for saving my life today," Georgia said as they stood at the gate. "And thank you for the company at supper. I hope I was not too forward in inviting you." "My mother would say I was too bold, but I have decided that the West requires a certain boldness, does it not?" Ethan smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. "Your mother might have a point, but I am glad for your boldness. I enjoyed the evening, Miss Norris. More than I expected to, if I am being honest." "Then perhaps we could do it again sometime," Georgia asked, and there was a hopeful note in her voice that did something strange to Ethan's chest. "I mean, if you are not leaving town immediately. It would be nice to have a friend here, someone who knows the area and can help me understand this new home of mine." "I would like that," Ethan heard himself say, and realized he meant it. "I will be around for another few weeks at least, finishing up at the Murphy place. Maybe I could show you some of the country around here once you are more settled." "I would love that," Georgia said, her smile bright even in the dim light from the house windows. "Good night, Mr. Hayes." "Ethan," he said. "You can call me Ethan." "Then you must call me Georgia." "Good night, Ethan." He tipped his hat and turned to walk back to where he had left his horse tied in front of the hotel. As he rode back out to the Murphy ranch under a sky brilliant with stars, Ethan felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense of anticipation for tomorrow. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was curious about what came next, about possibilities that extended beyond the next job or the next town. The following days fell into a pattern that surprised Ethan with its sweetness. He would finish his work at the ranch and ride into town, timing his arrival for when Georgia finished her preparations at the schoolhouse. She was due to start teaching in 2 weeks and spent her days organizing the classroom, reviewing the curriculum, and meeting with parents who wanted to assess the new teacher from Boston. Ethan found excuses to help, fixing a broken window in the schoolhouse, building new shelves for books, repairing desks that had grown wobbly over years of use. Georgia would bring lunch, and they would sit outside under the shade of a cottonwood tree, eating sandwiches and talking about everything and nothing. She told him about the books she loved, the places she hoped to travel someday, her dreams of making a real difference in children's lives. He found himself sharing stories from his past that he had never told anyone, about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the war and what it had taken from him, about the years of drifting that had followed. "Why did you never settle down?" Georgia asked one afternoon as they watched clouds drift across the brilliant blue sky. "Never marry, have a family." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "I guess I never felt like I had anything to offer. The war changed me, made me hard inside. I saw things, did things, that made me question whether I was fit for normal life. By the time I came out west, I had gotten used to being alone, started to prefer it even, or at least I told myself I did." "And now?" Georgia asked softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in the way the dappled sunlight played across her face, the intelligence and kindness in her green eyes, the hope she carried with her like a lamp in the darkness. "Now I am not so sure. Being around you makes me remember there are things worth hoping for, worth working toward. You make the world seem less harsh somehow." Georgia reached out and took his hand, a bold gesture that made his breath catch. "You saved my life, Ethan, but I think maybe you are saving me in other ways too. This town, this new life, it is exciting but also frightening. Having you here, having your friendship and your strength to lean on, it makes everything feel possible instead of overwhelming." Her touch was warm, and Ethan found himself wanting to pull her closer, to cross the distance between them, both physical and emotional. But he also did not want to rush, did not want to ruin this fragile new thing growing between them by moving too fast or presuming too much. "I am glad I can help," he said, squeezing her hand gently before reluctantly releasing it. "You have more strength than you know, Georgia. I see it in how you have thrown yourself into preparing for the school, how you talk to people in town, how you are not afraid to be yourself even in a place so different from what you knew. You do not need me to be strong, but I like being here with you anyway." The days turned into a week, then 2. Georgia's teaching position began, and she threw herself into it with the same enthusiasm and dedication Ethan had come to expect from her. He would stop by after school sometimes, finding excuses to linger and help with small tasks while she told him about her students, the challenges and triumphs of each day. She spoke with such affection about the children, such genuine care for their well-being and education, that Ethan could see why she had been called to this work. Meanwhile, the sale of the Murphy Ranch was finalized, and the new owner, a man from Texas with his own crew of workers, took possession. Ethan found himself without a job for the first time in years, but instead of the familiar anxiety that usually accompanied such transitions, he felt only a strange sense of freedom. He had saved most of his wages over the years, having few expenses and no vices that cost much money. He had enough to keep himself for several months if he was careful, which gave him time to figure out his next move. The problem was that his next move had become complicated by Georgia Norris. Every time he thought about signing on with another ranch, possibly one far from Naco, his chest would tighten with reluctance. The idea of leaving her, of riding away and probably never seeing her again, felt wrong in a way he could not fully articulate. But staying required something more than just finding local work. It required admitting what he had been feeling, putting a name to the emotions that had been building since that first afternoon when he had pulled her runaway wagon to a stop. He was in love with her. The realization hit him one evening, as he sat outside the small room he had rented in town after leaving the Murphy Ranch. He was 42 years old, had sworn off the possibility of love decades ago, and yet here he was, completely and thoroughly in love with a 23-year-old schoolteacher from Boston, who had somehow seen past all his rough edges to the man underneath. The question was what to do about it. Ethan had no illusions about the gap between them, not just in age but in education and refinement. Georgia was cultured and intelligent, comfortable with books and ideas in ways he had never been. He could read and write well enough, but his education had ended early when farm work demanded his help. What could he possibly offer a woman like her beyond a life of hardship and uncertainty? These doubts circled in his mind as he prepared for bed that night, but they were interrupted by a commotion in the street below. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass, and then a woman's scream cut through the evening air. Ethan was on his feet and out the door before he fully processed what he was doing. Instinct and old training taking over in the street, he found a scene of chaos. Several drunk miners had apparently taken offense at something and were causing trouble outside one of the saloons. The sheriff and his deputy were trying to restore order, but the situation was escalating rather than calming down. And there, caught in the middle of it all, was Georgia, clutching a basket of supplies and looking terrified as one of the drunk miners stumbled toward her with unclear intentions. Ethan moved quickly, putting himself between Georgia and the miner before the man could reach her. "Back off," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations. "The lady is not part of your fight." The miner, too drunk to think clearly, took a swing at Ethan instead. It was a clumsy punch, easily dodged, but it gave the sheriff the opening he needed to grab the man from behind. Within minutes, the deputies had the troublemakers restrained and were hauling them off to the jail to sleep off their liquor. Ethan turned to Georgia, who was shaking slightly but otherwise appeared unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, wanting to touch her but not sure if he should. "I am fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just startled. I was returning from visiting one of my students whose mother is ill, and suddenly everything erupted around me." "Thank goodness you were here." "Come on," Ethan said, taking her basket in one hand and offering her his arm with the other. "Let me walk you home. It is getting late for you to be out alone anyway." They walked through the now quiet streets, Georgia's hand resting on Ethan's arm in a way that felt both natural and significant. The evening air had cooled, carrying the scent of desert sage and the distant smell of wood smoke from supper fires. "This is the second time you have rescued me," Georgia said as they neared Mrs. Crawford's house. "I am starting to think I am either very unlucky or very lucky, depending on how you look at it." "I would say lucky," Ethan replied, "because you were not actually hurt either time." "I would say lucky because you were there both times," Georgia countered. She stopped walking and turned to face him, looking up at him with an expression that made his heart pound. "Ethan, I need to say something, and I am just going to be direct because I have learned that life out here does not leave much room for subtlety. I care for you. More than I should, probably, given that we have only known each other a few weeks. But I cannot help how I feel, and I do not want to hide it." Ethan felt like all the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Georgia, I am 20 years older than you. I have nothing to offer you except a strong back and a decent work ethic." You could have any man you wanted, someone educated and refined, someone who could give you the life you deserve. I do not want any man, Georgia said firmly. I want you. I want your kindness and your quiet strength. I want the way you listen when I talk about my students, the way you fixed every broken thing in the schoolhouse without being asked, the way you see me as capable and strong while still being protective when I need it. I want your company and your conversation and your smile that you seem to save only for me. And I think, if I am reading this right, that you might want those things for me too. I do, Ethan admitted, the words coming out rough with emotion. I want all of that and more. But Georgia, I am scared of disappointing you. I am scared that you will wake up one day and realize you settled for a broken-down cowboy when you could have had so much better. Georgia stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face with a gentleness that made his eyes sting with unexpected tears. You are not broken, Ethan Hayes. You are one of the most whole, genuine people I have ever met, and I am not settling. I am choosing. I am choosing you if you will have me. He could not help himself then. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her pressed against him. I will have you, he whispered against the top of her head. I will have you and do everything in my power to make you happy if you truly want this. I truly want this, Georgia said, her arms wrapping around his waist. I truly want you. They stood there in the street for a long moment, holding each other under the stars, both of them feeling like they had found something they had not even known they were searching for. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan kept one arm around Georgia's shoulders as they walked the rest of the way to her door. I need to find work, he said as they stood at her gate. Something stable, so I can stay in Naco and court you properly. I have some money saved, but I need to be able to support myself, support us if things go the way I hope they will. There is an opening at the copper mine, Georgia said. One of my students' fathers manages it. He mentioned they need someone reliable to oversee the mules and equipment maintenance. It is not ranch work, but it would keep you in town. I will talk to him tomorrow, Ethan promised. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a chaste gesture that still felt monumental. Sleep well, Georgia. Sleep well, Ethan, she replied, her smile radiant in the lamplight spilling from the windows. The next morning, Ethan presented himself at the copper mine and met with Georgia's student's father, a man named William Chen, who had come from California and worked his way up through the mining operations to a management position. They talked for nearly an hour with William asking questions about Ethan's experience and background. When Ethan mentioned his time in the war, William nodded thoughtfully. I fought too, he said quietly. Different side of the country, but same war. I understand what that does to a man, the way it changes you. But Miss Norris spoke highly of you when she mentioned you might be looking for work. She said you were reliable, skilled with animals and equipment, and honest. That counts for a lot with me. Ethan got the job, starting immediately. The work was different from ranch work, but not unpleasant. He was responsible for the mules that hauled ore carts, making sure they were healthy and well treated. He also oversaw maintenance of the lifting equipment and made sure safety protocols were followed. It was steady work with decent pay, and more importantly, it allowed him to stay in Naco over the following months. Ethan and Georgia's courtship progressed with a sweetness that surprised everyone, including themselves. In a town where most relationships formed quickly out of necessity or loneliness, theirs was built on genuine friendship and mutual respect that deepened into profound love. They would take walks in the evening after Georgia finished grading papers, talking about their days and their dreams. On Sundays, they would ride out into the surrounding country, Ethan teaching Georgia to handle a horse better, and showing her the hidden beautiful places he had discovered during his time in the area. The town took notice of their relationship with a mixture of approval and curiosity. The age difference raised some eyebrows at first, but it was clear to anyone who saw them together that what they had was genuine. The sheriff's wife, who served on the school board, told anyone who would listen that she had never seen Georgia happier or more settled. The mine workers, initially skeptical of their reserved new supervisor, began to respect Ethan when they saw that he worked as hard as any of them, and treated both the mules and the men with equal fairness and consideration. As summer gave way to fall and the brutal Arizona heat finally broke, Ethan began to think seriously about marriage. He wanted to do it right, to ask Georgia properly and give her a ring even if it was modest. He saved every penny he could spare from his wages, determined to buy her something worthy of what she meant to him. One Saturday in October, he rode to Tombstone, the nearest city of any size, and spent hours in a jeweler's shop looking at rings. He finally settled on a simple gold band with a small emerald that reminded him of Georgia's eyes. It cost him nearly 3 months' wages, but when he held it in his hand and imagined placing it on her finger, he knew it was worth every cent. He had planned to propose on a Sunday ride, at a spot overlooking a valley where autumn wildflowers somehow still bloomed despite the arid climate. But fate had other plans. 2 days before his planned proposal, Georgia showed up at the mine just as Ethan was finishing his shift, her face pale and her usual composure shaken. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, wiping his hands on his work pants and moving to her side. "Are you hurt? Is someone hurt?" "No, nothing like that," Georgia said, but she was clearly upset about something. "Can we talk?" Privately, they walked away from the mine buildings to a spot where they could see the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Georgia was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan felt worry gnawing at his gut. Had she changed her mind about him? Had she realized she wanted to return to Boston after all? "I received a letter today," Georgia finally said, "from my mother in Philadelphia. She wants me to come visit for Christmas and the New Year. She has someone she wants me to meet, a banker friend of my stepfather who is looking for a suitable wife. She thinks I am wasting my life out here in the wilderness, as she called it, and that I need to come to my senses and return to civilization." Ethan felt his heart sink. "What did you tell her?" "I have not written back yet," Georgia said, "but I am going to tell her no, of course. I am going to tell her that my life is here now, that I love my teaching position and have no intention of returning east." "But Ethan, I realized something when I read her letter. I realized that I want to tell her about you, about us. I want to tell her I am in love and planning to build a life with someone here. But we have never actually talked about the future, not specifically. We have been courting for months, and I know what I want, but I do not know what you are thinking or planning." Relief washed through Ethan, so powerful it made him laugh. Georgia looked startled by his reaction, and he quickly sobered and took both her hands in his. "I am thinking that I love you more than I thought possible to love anyone," he said. "I am thinking that every day I wake up grateful you came into my life. I am thinking that I was planning to propose to you this Sunday, and I have a ring in my room that I bought last week in Tombstone, but I can do it right now instead if you want to know where I stand on our future." Georgia's eyes went wide, filling with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks. "You were going to propose." "I am going to propose," Ethan corrected. "Right now, if you will let me." He dropped to one knee right there in the dust beside the copper mine, reaching into his pocket for the small box he had carried with him every day since buying it, just waiting for the right moment. He opened it to reveal the ring, and Georgia made a small sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Georgia Norris, You rescued me from a lonely life I did not even realize was lonely until you showed me what it could be like to truly connect with another person. You brought light and hope and laughter into my world. You make me want to be better, do better, hope for more. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Georgia said immediately, not even hesitating. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, Ethan Hayes. I will marry you and build a life with you and love you for as long as we both shall live." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the emerald catching the last rays of sunlight and gleaming bright. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time, pouring all his love and hope and promise into that kiss. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck and holding him close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Georgia laughed with pure joy. "This was not how I imagined this conversation going when I came to find you." "Life rarely goes how we imagine," Ethan said, touching his forehead to hers. "But sometimes it goes better. When should we get married?" "How long do you want to wait?" "Not long," Georgia said firmly. "I do not see any reason to wait months for a big, elaborate wedding. I want to marry you as soon as we can arrange it." "Is that too forward?" "I love your forwardness," Ethan assured her. "Always have. How about a month? That will give you time to write to your mother and tell her the news and give us time to make whatever preparations are needed." They were married on a bright Saturday in mid-November, in the little church in Naco with half the town in attendance. Georgia wore a simple but lovely white dress that the seamstress in town had made, and Ethan wore a new suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but that Georgia assured him made him look devastatingly handsome. The sheriff's wife stood up as Georgia's matron of honor, and William Chen from the mine stood up for Ethan. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with Pastor Morrison speaking about love and commitment and partnership. When Ethan placed the wedding band on Georgia's finger next to her engagement ring, his hand shook slightly with the magnitude of the moment. This woman had agreed to spend her life with him, to bind her fate to his. It was humbling and exhilarating in equal measure. "I love you," he whispered as the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. "I love you too," Georgia whispered back, and then they were kissing, sealing their vows in front of God and the community. The reception was held in the hotel restaurant, with food and music and dancing that went on into the evening. Ethan, who had not danced in 20 years, found himself stumbling through a waltz with his new wife, both of them laughing at his missteps. But Georgia did not seem to mind, her face glowing with happiness as they moved together. They had rented a small house on the edge of town, a modest 2-bedroom structure with a kitchen and sitting room. It was not fancy, but Georgia had made it into a home over the previous weeks, sewing curtains and arranging the furniture they had purchased together. When Ethan carried her over the threshold that night, she laughed with delight at the traditional gesture. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," he said, setting her down gently in their front room. "Welcome home to you too," Georgia replied, reaching up to loosen his tie. "This is really ours, Ethan, our home, our life, our future. Can you believe it? Some days I still have to pinch myself to make sure it is real," he admitted. "I keep thinking I will wake up and find out this has all been a dream." "It is real," Georgia assured him, taking his hand and placing it over her heart so he could feel it beating. "I am real and this is real and we are really and truly married. Forever, Ethan. You are stuck with me now." "That is all I want," he said, pulling her close, "to be stuck with you for the rest of my life." Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Adjusting to living together required compromise and patience from both of them. Ethan had lived alone for so long that having someone else in his space all the time took getting used to. Georgia, used to her independence, sometimes chafed at the expectations placed on married women in a small western town. But they worked through each challenge with communication and love, always choosing each other, even when it was difficult. Georgia continued teaching, though some of the older women in town thought it was improper for a married woman to work outside the home. Ethan supported her completely, recognizing that teaching was not just a job for her but a calling. He took pride in her success with the children, in the way the school board praised her methods and results. By the end of her second year teaching, enrollment had increased as word spread of the quality of education available in Naco, and the board was discussing building a larger schoolhouse. Ethan thrived in his position at the mine, earning promotions and respect for his hard work and fair treatment of both men and animals. He found satisfaction in the work that surprised him, enjoying the challenge of improving efficiency and safety. The mine owner, recognizing his value, gave him increasing responsibility and a salary that allowed them to save money and make improvements to their home. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with anxiety for both of them. Ethan worried about Georgia's health, about whether she was strong enough for childbirth in a place where medical care was limited. Georgia worried about whether she could continue teaching, about whether they were ready for the responsibility of a child. But underneath, the worries was pure happiness at the idea of creating a family together. Georgia taught until she was nearly 6 months along, finally stopping when the school board gently suggested it was time. She spent the last months of her pregnancy preparing their small second bedroom as a nursery, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, reading every book she could find about infant care. Ethan built a cradle from smooth pine, spending hours sanding it until there were no rough edges that could harm delicate skin. Their son was born on a hot August afternoon in 1887, after nearly 20 hours of labor that left both Georgia and Ethan exhausted. The doctor who had ridden in from Bisbee declared it a healthy delivery despite the length, and when he placed the squalling red-faced infant in Ethan's arms, the hardened cowboy found himself weeping openly. "He is perfect," Ethan said, staring down at the tiny person they had created. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Georgia asked from the bed, her face pale but radiant with joy despite her exhaustion. They had discussed names for months without deciding on anything definite, but looking at his son's face, Ethan knew immediately. "Samuel," he said. "After Samuel Murphy, who gave me the job that brought me to Naco, that put me in the right place at the right time to meet you. Samuel Murphy set all of this in motion, even if he did not know it. I would like to honor that." "Samuel Hayes," Georgia said, testing the name. "I like it." "Samuel Ethan Hayes, so he has part of his father too." Baby Samuel was a good-natured child who grew strong and healthy despite the harsh Arizona climate. Georgia returned to teaching when Samuel was 6 months old, and they worked out an arrangement where a trusted neighbor woman watched the baby during school hours. Ethan would rush home from the mine each day to see his son, marveling at each new development, each small milestone. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, their small house began to feel cramped. Ethan started planning an addition, spending his evenings drawing out designs and calculating costs. By the time Samuel was 2, Ethan had saved enough to hire help, and they added 2 bedrooms and expanded the kitchen. It was during the construction that Georgia discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1890, an easier labor than Samuel's had been. Ethan was present for the birth, holding Georgia's hand and whispering encouragement. When the doctor announced it was a girl, Ethan felt his heart expand even further, something he had not thought possible. "Evelyn," Georgia said when she held their daughter for the first time. "For your mother, if that is all right. You told me once that she was a kind woman who deserved better than the hard life she had. Maybe we can honor her memory this way." Ethan had to step outside for a moment to compose himself, overwhelmed by emotion. His mother had died when he was just 12, worn down by poverty and endless work. That Georgia wanted to name their daughter after her, wanted to honor a woman she had never met, meant more to him than he could express. Life settled into a joyful rhythm with 2 young children filling the house with noise and laughter. Samuel was a curious, energetic boy who reminded Ethan of himself at that age, always into something and full of questions. Evelyn was quieter, more thoughtful, with her mother's intelligence already evident even as a toddler. Ethan found fatherhood to be simultaneously the most exhausting and rewarding experience of his life. Georgia continued teaching, though she reduced her hours and focused more on curriculum development and training other teachers as the school system expanded. She had become a respected figure in Naco, known for her dedication to education and her innovative teaching methods. The territorial governor even visited once to observe her classroom, and afterward wrote a letter praising her work. Ethan had risen to the position of operations manager at the mine, overseeing all the day-to-day activities. It was demanding work that sometimes required long hours, but he made sure never to let it interfere with his family time. He had seen too many men lose their families to work, and he was determined that would not happen to him. Every evening, no matter how tired he would read to Samuel and Evelyn before bed, making up stories about cowboys and horses that made them giggle with delight. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan arranged a rare evening out. They left the children with the sheriff's wife, who adored Samuel and Evelyn and spoiled them shamelessly whenever she got the chance. Ethan took Georgia to the nicest restaurant in Tombstone, a 2-hour ride but worth it for the special occasion. Over dinner, they reminisced about their courtship and early marriage, laughing at the awkward moments and marveling at how much had changed. Georgia was 33 now, still beautiful but with a maturity and confidence that had only deepened over the years. Ethan was 52, his hair fully gray now but his body still strong from hard work. They had built a good life together, better than either of them had dared to dream. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked over dessert. "Giving up the chance to return east to have an easier life?" Georgia reached across the table to take his hand, her wedding ring glinting in the lamplight. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once in 10 years have I regretted choosing you, choosing this life. You gave me exactly what I was searching for when I came west: purpose, meaning, and love beyond measure. We have built something real here, Ethan. A family, a place in the community, a legacy through our children and my students. How could I regret any of that? I just want to make sure you are happy," Ethan said. "That has always been my goal from the day I married you." "I am happy," Georgia assured him. "Deeply, completely happy." "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Ethan replied honestly. "You know, that day I pulled your runaway wagon to a stop, I had no idea I was saving my own life too. I was so lonely, Georgia, even though I did not admit it to myself. I had convinced myself that solitude was the same as peace. But then you came along and showed me what I had been missing. You rescued me from a lonely life, just as surely as I rescued you from that wagon." "We rescued each other," Georgia said softly. "That is what love does, I think. It saves us from ourselves, from the small, cramped lives we might otherwise lead. It opens up possibilities we could not see alone." They stayed in Tombstone that night at a hotel, a rare night of privacy and romance without the needs of children interrupting. They talked until late, then made love with the passion and tenderness that had only deepened over their years together. It was not the desperate newness of their wedding night, but something richer, built on complete trust and knowledge of each other. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a bright, adventurous boy who loved horses and books in equal measure, combining his father's practical skills with his mother's intellectual curiosity. Evelyn was quieter but equally intelligent, showing an early aptitude for music and art. When she was 6, Ethan used some of their savings to order a piano from San Francisco, a massive undertaking given the logistics of shipping it to Naco. But when he saw Evelyn's face light up as she touched the keys for the first time, he knew it was worth every penny and ounce of effort. In 1895, Arizona Territory was experiencing growing pains as it moved toward eventual statehood. Naco had grown from a rough mining town into a proper community with churches, schools, and businesses. The mine where Ethan worked had expanded operations, bringing more families to the area. Georgia had helped establish a small library and served on multiple committees aimed at improving life in the territory. That summer, Samuel, now 8 years old, asked if he could learn to ride properly. Ethan had been giving him basic lessons for years, but Samuel wanted to do more, wanted to learn ranch work like his father had known. Ethan arranged with a local rancher for Samuel to spend part of his summer helping out, learning the skills that had defined so much of Ethan's own life. Watching his son ride off that first morning, confident and excited, Ethan felt the passage of time acutely. Samuel was growing up, becoming his own person. In a few more years, he would be a young man making his own choices about his future. The realization was both proud and bittersweet. "He will be fine," Georgia said, coming to stand beside Ethan as they watched Samuel disappear down the road. "You taught him well. He has your strength and good sense." "He has your intelligence and curiosity too," Ethan replied. "He is going to do something important with his life, I can feel it. Maybe go to university back east, become someone significant." "He already is someone significant," Georgia said. "He is our son, and that is enough no matter what else he does. We raised him to be kind and honest and hard-working. The rest is just details." That evening, as had become their habit over the years, Ethan and Georgia sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant colors. Evelyn was inside practicing piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that Ethan had learned to treasure. "You remember the day we met?" Georgia asked, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. "You came riding out of nowhere like something from one of those adventure novels, and you saved my life." "I remember being terrified I would not reach you in time," Ethan said. "I remember seeing you clinging to that wagon seat and thinking that the world could not possibly be so cruel as to let you fall. And then I invited you to supper, bold as brass," Georgia continued, smiling at the memory. "My mother would have been scandalized, but something inside me knew even then. I knew you were important, that meeting you meant something. You changed everything for me," Ethan said quietly. "Before you, I was just drifting, moving from job to job with no real purpose beyond survival. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something, to hope for the future. You gave me a family and a home. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other those things," Georgia corrected gently. "That is what partnership means. We built this life together, stone by stone, choice by choice. And it is not finished yet, Ethan Hayes. We still have years ahead of us, more adventures to share." She was right, of course. The years continued, bringing the small dramas and joys of family life. Samuel did indeed go to university, attending school in Tucson, before going on to study engineering in California. Evelyn developed into a talented pianist and eventually opened a music school in Naco, teaching the next generation of children. Both children married and had children of their own, making Ethan and Georgia grandparents multiple times over. The mine eventually played out, as all mines do, but by then, Ethan had saved enough to purchase a small ranch outside town. It was not a large operation, just enough cattle and horses to keep him busy and productive in his retirement. Georgia officially retired from teaching at 62, but continued to tutor students and serve on the school board. As they grew older, Ethan and Georgia settled into a comfortable rhythm. Their days were quieter now, but no less rich for it. They would sit together reading in the evenings, or work in the garden Georgia had cultivated over the years, or ride out to visit their children and grandchildren. They had become fixtures in Naco, the couple who had helped build the community and who represented the best of what the territory could be. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a party that seemed to include half the town. Ethan, now 72 but still strong and clear-minded, was embarrassed by the attention but deeply touched. Person after person came up to tell stories about how Ethan or Georgia had helped them over the years, small kindnesses that had been forgotten but that had mattered. "You two are an inspiration," Pastor Morrison, long since retired himself, said during his toast. "You showed us all that love can thrive even in the harshest conditions, that commitment and partnership can weather any storm. You built not just a family, but a legacy of kindness and service that has shaped this entire community." Late that night, after all the guests had left and the decorations had been cleared away, Ethan and Georgia sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape they both loved. 30 years, Georgia marveled, looking at the wedding ring that had never left her finger. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together." "I like the second one better," Ethan said, pulling her close. "I like thinking we have always been together, that there was never a time when we were not meant for each other." "I like that too," Georgia agreed. "Though I will never forget the gift of that first moment, when you came riding up to save me. Everything good in my life came from that moment. Everything good in my life came from you being brave enough to invite a rough cowboy to supper," Ethan countered. "You could have just thanked me and let me ride away. But you took a chance on a lonely, broken-down man who did not even know he needed saving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands intertwined, hearts beating in the synchrony that came from decades of partnership. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. But here on this porch in Naco, Arizona, two people who had found each other against all odds knew that they had created their own constellation, their own pattern of meaning in the vast universe. "I love you," Georgia whispered. "Forever and always, Ethan Hayes." "I love you too," Ethan replied. "Forever and always, Georgia Hayes. Thank you for rescuing me from a lonely life. Thank you for giving me a reason to hope, to dream, to build something lasting. Thank you for being mine." The years that followed were gentle ones, touched with the sweetness that comes from a life well lived and love fully realized. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended weddings and celebrations, and continued to be active in the community as long as their health allowed. When Arizona finally achieved statehood in 1912, Ethan and Georgia were invited to the ceremony as honored citizens who had helped build the foundation of what the state had become. Ethan lived to the remarkable age of 86, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the home he and Georgia had shared for over 40 years. Georgia survived him by 3 years, never remarrying but living those final years surrounded by the large, loving family they had created together. When she died at 76, the entire town of Naco turned out for her funeral, testament to the lives she had touched through her decades of teaching and service. They were buried side by side in the Naco cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, Ethan and Georgia Hayes. Together in life, together in eternity, they saved each other. And indeed they had, in all the ways that mattered. A lonely cowboy and a brave schoolteacher had found each other on a dusty road in Arizona Territory and had built something beautiful from that chance encounter. They had proven that love could flourish in the harshest conditions. That commitment and partnership could create a legacy that outlasted any individual life. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations of how Grandpa Ethan had rescued Grandma Georgia from a runaway wagon and how she had rescued him from a lonely life. It became family legend, embellished perhaps, but true in its essentials. Two people who had each been searching for meaning and connection had found it in each other, and in doing so had created ripples of love and kindness that spread far beyond themselves. In the end, that was their greatest accomplishment. Not the positions they held or the recognition they received, but the simple fact that they had loved each other well and completely, and that love had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. They had shown by example that true partnership meant supporting each other's dreams while building shared ones. That love meant choosing each other again and again through all the challenges life presented. The house where they had raised their family stood for many more decades, eventually becoming a historical landmark in Naco. The piano Ethan had bought for Evelyn was preserved and donated to the school, where it continued to bring music to children long after both Ethan and Georgia were gone. The stories of Georgia's innovative teaching methods influenced educators throughout the state. The safety protocols Ethan had implemented at the mine became standard practice across the territory. But more than any physical legacy, what Ethan and Georgia left behind was proof that love could conquer loneliness, that two people from completely different backgrounds could build a life of meaning and joy together, that taking a chance on connection was always worth the risk. They had both been brave that day when the runaway wagon brought them together, Ethan in risking his safety to save a stranger, Georgia in boldly inviting him to supper, and then later in being honest about her feelings. That bravery, that willingness to be vulnerable and open to possibility, had been rewarded with a love story for the ages. Not the dramatic, tragic kind of love that burns bright and brief, but the sustainable, enduring kind that grows deeper and richer with each passing year. The kind of love that sustains through hard times and celebrates through good times. The kind of love that creates families and communities and legacies. In the wild, often harsh landscape of the American West in the late 19th century, Ethan Hayes and Georgia Norris had found each other and had built something gentle and lasting. Their story stood as a testament to the power of human connection, to the possibility of redemption and new beginnings, to the transformative nature of love freely given and gratefully received. The runaway wagon that had brought them together had been an accident of circumstance, but what they built from that moment was entirely intentional. Every day they chose each other. Every challenge they faced together made them stronger. Every joy they shared multiplied their happiness. They proved that it was never too late to find love, that age differences mattered less than compatibility of hearts and minds, that a lonely cowboy and an educated schoolteacher could create a partnership of equals despite their different backgrounds. And so their story ended not with drama or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and love fully realized. They had rescued each other in every way that mattered, and in doing so, had created something beautiful that would echo through generations. In the dusty streets of Naco, Arizona, on a hot afternoon in 1885, two souls had collided in a moment of crisis and had chosen to turn that crisis into opportunity. That choice, repeated daily for 4 decades, had been enough to build a love story that time itself could not diminish.